again, I'll repeat, and I think I said this before, if you or your group or an organization that you work with would be interested in doing a presentation on something that you care about, we want to hear as many voices as possible from our community at Seattle Central. So I encourage you to come to think about that and come talk to me. We can help you out. This week it is a great pleasure for me to welcome Kelsey Macki, who teaches communication here at Seattle Central, so please give her a hand.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the library puts this series on and invites instructors and students to share in their expertise, so I'm glad to be here. I am wondering what class you guys are with.
It's a English 101 class.
Awesome.
And right now we're doing a unit on environmentalism and nature. So.
Cool, great. So I am moderately qualified to talk on this topic. And that comes from the fact that while I was in graduate school, what I studied was food and food communication. So how we communicate about food, how food affects, or how that communication affects what we choose to eat, those kinds of things. But I've also done some research about food deserts so that I can be, again, moderately more equipped to talk to you about it today. So I have a lot of social understanding of food deserts and sort of communicative understanding of food deserts, but there's also a certain amount, as you'll see, related to food deserts that has to do with politics and geography, and those things I am less qualified to comment on, but I do look forward to hearing what you have to say about them. So to get started, I want to talk about one of the first food deserts. This is Dorothea Lange's photograph of Migrant Mother, which was taken in 1936 during the Great Depression. Have any of you seen this photo before?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's a very iconic photograph, right? It was used by the government to promote the struggles that many low-income, well, really everyone at that time, were having in order to feed themselves. What is not typically known about this photograph is that this actually is a migrant Native American who came from an Oklahoma reservation to California to get work so that she could feed her family. But she became the face of this very white political movement in the United States when in fact that her face did not match that movement. A face that did match that movement is MFK Fisher, who was a well-to-do white woman from the East Coast. And she was a single mother, and divorced, which was a struggle at that time, regardless of your political or economic status. And she made a comment in her book, published in 1937, that first we eat, then we do everything else. And both the migrant mother and MFK Fisher had this same struggle, but in very different economic classes. So the reason that she says that, and the reason that it's true, is because we must eat before we do anything else. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Have any of you studied this in psychology ever? Yeah, so Maslow suggests that in order for us to move on to greater concerns, like, is there a God? What makes for art, right? Questions like that. Am I liked? Do I have friends? We have to meet some pretty basic needs first, and food is paramount on that list. So MFK Fisher is right when she says that first we eat and then we do everything else. You must eat, and after that you can worry about whether that food is safe, whether you're going to have friends while you're eating it, whether it makes you look good or not, but first you got to have it. And so that is why Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother was in California, right? Because she needed food first before she could do anything else. And that is still true today. But what we need to keep in mind is that food deserts actually come out of social inequity more than anything else. So I want to give us first a little vocabulary to talk about food deserts. Then we're going to look at how our government identifies food deserts, what advocacy is being done for food deserts, and then what some of the concerns might be about that system. And that will take me about 15 minutes, and then we should have half an hour to discuss further. Please interrupt me at whatever point if you've got questions. I am delighted to have interruptions. So first let's take a look at how we define food deserts. So according to the USDA, food desert is used as a political term, so the USDA provides this definition. The first requirement for something to be labeled as a food desert is it must be an urban neighborhood or rural town.
Who was this term coined?
It started in Britain in I think the 1990s, and it has transferred over here. It has grown a lot in terms of popularity in the last 10 years, essentially. And the USDA has started using it since in 2006. Okay. So anyway, first requirement: urban neighborhoods and rural towns. What does that tell you?
Robert?
Yeah, poor people, right? And along with that, there must be no access to fresh, healthy, and affordable food. So fresh, healthy, and affordable food is considered vegetables, fruits, whole grains, not processed grains, and fresh meats and dairy, right? So it's really fresh foods, perishable foods is what we're talking about. So no ready access means that there's no grocery store nearby, there's no bodega nearby, there's no farm stand nearby where somebody can go and buy an apple, right? They can maybe get apple chips at the gas station, but they cannot actually buy an apple.
Could there be a Whole Foods nearby?
We're gonna get to that, yeah. Right now, no. According to this definition, no. If they don't have, if there's a Whole Foods in the neighborhood, it's not a food desert.
It's kind of unaffordable though.
Yeah, yes.
What about people growing their own food, which when I think about rural, I think people are probably processing a lot of their own food, or are they still considered to be in a food desert in that case if they're hunting?
Yeah, they're
fishing,
still considered to be in a
growing?
food desert if they cannot access food from a licensed food producer, right? Because that's part of how they create these definitions, right? A license for a supermarket. And also in these rural communities, what's important to keep in mind is that a lot of the rural communities, their income is coming from large-scale factory farming or agribusiness. So they might be farmers and be growing tons and tons of wheat or something, or corn, but that does not mean they're necessarily producing food for themselves or for others. I think many of them do, right? They have their own vegetable gardens or things like that, but a lot of times the farming is more of an industrial scale. And the last thing is that these food deserts do have fast food restaurants and convenience stores. So, sometimes suggested that these not be called food deserts, but food swamps, because it's not that they don't have food at all. They do have food, it's just not fresh food, right? It is fast food and convenience store food, typically. So where do you do your grocery shopping in that town or that location? You go to the convenience store, right? So whatever you're eating is already canned or processed, or essentially the food that you have access to is shelf stable, which means that it can sit on your shelf for years and years and be just fine. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
So these are the criteria that the USDA has for food deserts. But there is also a situation of food insecurity. So a lot of times we see a crossover between food deserts and food insecurity. And food insecurity is also a term coined by the USDA to define people who do not have continued access to food. So if you are labeled food insecure, that means that you have limited or uncertain availability of nutritional and safe food. So what that might mean is that you have access to food that is not considered healthy, right? So you've got access to fast food, or you've got access to canned food, or you have access to food but you can't afford it, essentially. And what that, in terms of safe foods, what they mean by that is that you might be someone who is dumpster diving or scavenging for food, right? And in that case, you could be putting yourself in an unsafe food situation. Or you do not have space to maintain the safety of your food. If somebody gives you a cream pie and you don't have a refrigerator, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna save this cream pie for later, and you leave it on the bench where you live, that cream pie is going to become unsafe, right? So it has something to do as well with where you reside, if you reside anywhere. And the second criteria is that you have no ability to acquire these foods or socially acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways. And again, this has to do with maybe you have access to food, but in order to eat it, you have to steal it, right? So it is not socially acceptable. So people who are labeled as food insecure, right? And there's different levels. You can be somewhat insecure, you can be somewhat secure, you can be highly secure, and you can be very insecure. These families and people tend to acquire food in ways that are considered socially unacceptable. By stealing or scavenging, or they acquire food through food banks and food pantries. Are you guys familiar with food banks and food pantries? Right?
Food banks?
Yeah, food banks is a place where you go and you say, I don't have any food, and they say, great, here's a box with 12 cans. You've got 4 soup, 4 vegetables, 4 fruit.
You might get butter and
Churches.
cheese from
Right.
the government.
Yep, you might get eggs, milk, that kind of thing. Right, so, and also those people who use food stamps are considered, or I guess it's called SNAP now, if you get SNAP benefits, those individuals are considered food insecure, which is why they are being subsidized by the government. So that's food insecurity. And the reason I bring up food insecurity is because frequently we have a crossover between a food desert, right? We got low income people with no access to fresh foods and food insecurity, right? So there's not a lot of food available. They don't have much money. So not only do they not have access, but they also don't have the means of getting it even if it was there. So what that means is that the government is subsidizing the diets of those people through food banks or through the purchasing of food at less than stellar sources like convenience stores, right? So you can use your SNAP benefits to buy those things at convenience stores, but you don't have the ability to use your SNAP benefits then to buy vegetables or fruit unless you go well out of your way. Is that clear to everybody? So there's some crossover here. So, the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of vocabulary is access. So a lot of these definitions are based on the idea of access. So access is your freedom or ability to obtain or make use of something, right? In this school and in this city, I have access to free water, right? So when I am thirsty, I can get water and drink it, like I'm gonna do right now. All right? So access is your ability to get it and use it. So that's twofold. You gotta get it and you gotta use it. But there's a lot of different types of access that come into play when we are talking about food deserts. So the first is spatial access, right? How far are you from a place where you can buy food or nutritional food, right? I live really close to a McDonald's, but really far from a grocery store. So if I need to cook dinner at night and I don't have anything and I'm exhausted, I'm probably gonna go to McDonald's, right? Because it's close. I don't wanna drive all the way to the grocery store. So where you live and how far things are from you is certainly a factor. But the other one is mobility. If I have a QFC 10 minutes to me on the bus, or a McDonald's 5 minutes to me on the bus, and I have no car, right? It's easier for me to get on the bus and go to the McDonald's and have dinner than it is for me to go to the QFC, buy my ingredients, and bring them back home, right? So how you get around has a huge impact on this as well. The next part of access is economic access, and that's pretty evident, I think, in terms of the amount of money that you have to spend on food, right? And how far that dollar stretches. If you just need food and you need calories, you can spend 70 cents on a donut, which is like 300 calories, or you can spend 70 cents on an apple, which is like 60. So if what you need is calories because you are food insecure, that donut is looking pretty good. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. The other thing is education, right? And a lot of times education is tied to economic elements because the amount of education you have in a particular area affects what you're able to do with a good. If you do not know how to cook fresh foods like vegetables and fruits, you are not going to buy them, right? Because they will go to waste in your refrigerator. They are not useful to you if you don't have the knowledge for using them. And similarly, if you don't have the time to cook them, right, you are also not going to buy them, right? Especially if you have a limited budget, right? Time is money for most people. So if you have to spend time going to the store, buying the foods, bringing them home and cooking them, that might be time that then you can't spend working, right? And so if you're food insecure, you are probably trying to work a lot, right? And you may not have the time to expend in food preparation or food acquisition. The last thing is social, yes?
I would add energy.
Sure, yes, yeah.
Because sometimes it's the difference between getting enough sleep and not getting enough sleep. Or
right.
If you're exhausted from working, it's so much easier to get fast food than.
Right, yeah. I just moved into a new house in North Bend, which is further away than where I lived before. And we were moving in last weekend and I just forgot to eat breakfast, right? And I had no energy. And so what did I do? I drove to McDonald's, right? I drove to McDonald's and I bought a burger, right? And I never eat at McDonald's. I'd never eat at McDonald's, and I was so tired. I had no energy that all I could think to do was go to that McDonald's, right? So, and that's partially related to this last point of access, which is social and cultural access. So we have a lot of values about food, right, and practices related to food. My mom is somebody who drove a lot, went for her work when I was a kid, so we ate fast food with her all the time, which I thought was awesome, because my dad never let us eat fast food. He cooked all our meals. He was very much about producing food in the home. But when he was on vacation, we ate out constantly, which I thought was great. And so I got two very different value sets from my parents in terms of food, and about what made for good food and when it was appropriate to eat particular foods and that kind of thing. We all have this, right? This comes from our identities, it comes from our experience, and it comes from our backgrounds, which means that there are going to be some food outlets that you are comfortable going to and finding what you need, and there will be some food outlets that you are uncomfortable going into, and you will not find what you need, or you will not feel welcome there, right? And whether that's a truth of your experience or just based on your cultural values and boundaries doesn't matter, because it has a real effect on you, right? You truly feel uncomfortable in that space. It's the same idea as, you know, if a bar hosts if a bar that is frequented by white people hosts a Latino night, and the white person walks in the room and they see all the Latinos, they go, okay, I'm out of here, right? We have those same experiences in terms of food spaces, whether we feel welcome or not, based on our culture, value, identity. So, food deserts have become a big deal in the last few years because Michelle Obama is going to take care of it for us. So I think I can play this. Great. So here's a little note from Michelle Obama. She's going to solve the problem, okay?
Right now, there are 23.5 million Americans, including 6.5 million children, who live in what we call food deserts, in the inner city and in rural communities.
Lots of different definitions of food deserts, but most people basically say it's a place where there is not access, easy access, affordable access, reasonable access to fresh fruit, vegetables to a grocery store.
We see a preponderance, for example, of convenience stores and fast food restaurants, but very little healthy food options for those residents.
We are at the Fair Hill Elementary School in Philadelphia. We're focused on a tremendous program that they have here to reduce child obesity in this school, and also to encourage fresh food and healthy eating.
Our goal is ambitious. It's to eliminate food deserts in America completely in 7 years. Tackling the issue of accessibility and affordability is key to achieving the overall goal of solving childhood obesity in this generation. And we saw this example today during our visit to the Fresh Grocer at Progress Plaza. The last supermarket that was in that community closed more than 10 years ago. There were kids in that community who couldn't get the nutritious food that they needed during some of the most formative years of their lives. This is happening all across the country. We're setting people up for failure if we don't fix this. With a modest initial investment of about $400 million a year, we're going to use that money to leverage hundreds of millions of more from private and nonprofit sectors to bring grocery stores and other healthy food retailers to underserved communities all across this country. If you can do it here, we can do it around the country. So let's move. That's really the point. If we know it can be done, let's move, let's get it done. Let's give our kids everything they need and everything they deserve to be the best that they can be. Thank you so much.
Okay, so Michelle Obama, I take it back. This was not 2006, obviously, it was 2010. So by 2017, they're going to solve food deserts for us with $400 million. And in order to do that, they have been investing money in two things, the government. When I say they, I mean they. So they've been investing money in two things. The first thing is identifying food deserts. And so in order to identify food deserts, they have been using census data to compare areas that have low income and low access. And so if they can combine those two pieces of information, then they say, okay, this is a food desert. So low income obviously comes from taxes and your zip code. And then low access has to do with licenses for supermarkets, grocery stores, open air markets, that kind of thing. Those are the only factors that are used to determine the food deserts, okay? Zip code, income from taxes, licenses for grocery stores, right?
So, from zip code, we can know that place is low income or high income.
Yes, that and their taxes. So like if let's say we're a zip code and you submit your taxes to me, I'm the government, I can see how much money each of you made at the end of the year, right? That's public data. It might not be associated with your name, but it's associated with your zip code.
And you can look that up in the library.
Yeah.
You said that that's public data.
Yeah.
So I mean, if that's the case, then you can say some of these corporations that own supermarkets see that there's not any revenue in these neighborhoods, so then they decide not to open any
Bingo.
grocery stores.
Yeah, bingo. So this is according to the USDA, right? So they compare this data, then they have a map. And the map is on the internet and you can search it, okay? This is incredible. So this is, yeah. So it's on the internet, so you can search it and find out where the food deserts are in your community. So I pulled this data last night, and you can look at anywhere in the country, right?
Low income.
So this data, they have updated this data in 2010. They had it in 2006, they updated it in 2010 to include more parameters. So originally, food deserts were only designated if it was low income and no grocery store within a mile, okay? So that's these green areas here. Not surprisingly, many of them in our area are in South King County.
What a surprise.
Shocking, right? And then,
In the north.
and nothing in the north, and look at Bellevue. Oh, Bellevue's solid.
Surprisingly, there's
Yeah.
one in East Dove.
Well, yeah, that is, so here's the difference, all right? So the green is a mile. The orange, they added in 2010 because people complained that a mile was too much, especially if you don't have a car, right? The orange is half a mile, all right? And Seattle Central is right here.
That's not, there are grocery stores within less than half a mile.
Yeah.
Yes,
Same with
but
University of
from
Washington.
here.
Okay. What
But-
is that neighborhood now, the orange one?
This is South Lake Union. Can you believe that?
It sounds like Union has a Whole Foods.
Yes, it does. But this is from 2010, and I don't think they were open yet.
Oh.
But the fact, here's the point.
Changed a lot.
Yeah, here's the point. This data is not accurate, right? Not entirely accurate. Because I'm sorry, South Lake Union is a pretty wealthy place, if you ask me.
I have to say that
Yeah.
East Lake is a neighborhood that has no, which I think that actually is East Lake, not
Yeah.
South Lake Union, and East Lake has no grocery stores.
Well, there you go.
From the moment you hit East Lake,
Yes.
coming in from Fairview, all the way up to the U District, there is nothing but like two convenience stores.
So,
They got rid of the two up there on Cleveland.
So anyway, this data is for our area, right? Based on these two factors from the USDA. So the biggest takeaway for me, at least, is that this area over here, no problems. Over here, we got some problems. Okay, so what do we do about it? I want to talk about Detroit because they have been in the news a lot lately because a Whole Foods opened there yesterday. And
That's the first grocery store to open in Detroit in
years, eons, I don't know how long.
it was like 3 or 4 years ago that they lost the last one.
Yeah, so in the city, right? There are grocery stores outside of Detroit, but this was the first one in the city yesterday. Whole Foods opened up. But there's sort of 3 routes to advocacy that the government is helping to fund, right? So they are subsidizing these efforts. The first is improving offerings at existing locations. So Detroit has had an open air market that the government is helping to bring in more vegetables to, and they're subsidizing the prices so people have more access to them. They also are funding programs like this, which is called Detroit Fresh, which goes to those corner stores and convenience stores and delivers subsidized fresh vegetables, okay? The next option is urban gardening, so there's a lot of advocacy around this, right? Teaching people to grow their own food so that they can do it themselves. And then finally, we have just put in a grocery store, right? We got the middle of Detroit, there's no grocery store, we're gonna put one in. And so yesterday, Whole Foods opened in Detroit. which was, I believe, many years in the planning. I can't remember the number, but it was a long time coming. So, yes.
Where is
Whole
Detroit?
Foods is very expensive.
Yes, it
They
is.
cannot really afford to go into that store and spend their SNAP card in there.
This is where we're going, okay? So we're getting there, so don't forget that. So I want to talk about one thing that has been happening in the Seattle area, because this is coming to our area. It's a program called Stockbox Grocers, and a couple of graduates from the business program at Bainbridge Institute did a crowdsourcing campaign on the internet, like a Kickstarter, something like that, to raise the money to start a business that converts old shipping containers into sort of these drop-off grocery stores, right? So they can go into places that maybe there wasn't a grocery store before. So that's a local thing that's happening, and we see this same kind of effort happening in other places. Stockbox Grocers, yeah. So,
I just want to say there's a cool program here in Seattle where if people have fruit trees or other
Yeah.
food producing stuff that they're not, you know, like a tree goes ripe all at the same time and then you have hundreds and hundreds of plums. There's actually a program where you can go and look and people enter their addresses and say, like, come to my house and pick my
yes.
plums or
Yeah.
pears or apples or
And
whatever.
there are food banks that will come pick it all for you.
Yeah.
And Seattle Tills also runs a program like that.
Oh.
Okay, so as you have noticed, obviously there are some problems with both how we are identifying food deserts and how we are taking action on them. So that's what I want to discuss next. So the first thing that I want to discuss is that these food desert maps do not consider economic access or cultural access to a grocery store, food outlet, or product. So in Detroit will no longer, or this 1 mile radius or whatever around Whole Foods will no longer be considered a food desert. However, if it is still in a low income neighborhood, those people cannot afford to shop there, nor do they maybe want to shop there, because they will not necessarily have foods or be a cultural space that they feel welcome in, right? And actually, the university, okay, so here's my example. If somebody who wants to buy this product, right, some people are gonna be fine buying this one, some people are gonna be fine buying this one, and some people would never buy this one, and some people would never buy this one, right? This is what Whole Foods has for Oreos, right?
Wow.
This is what Walmart has, right? So there are a lot of values and access issues related to food, not just Oreos, but this is the example. Is that clear to you guys?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so the next concern is modes of transportation and time, and I mentioned this already. If you're in a car, bike, bus, that's very different than walking. So that is a consideration, and especially when compared with time. So there was actually a study done by Zhao et al. In 2012 at the University of Washington that took these factors of grocery store cost and transportation into account when looking at food deserts in our area. So this is slightly expanded from what I had earlier, right? Here's Lake Washington in here. And on this side, this top row, this is access to low-cost supermarkets. This bottom one is high-cost supermarkets. So they didn't tell you the name of the supermarkets, but I can assume that this is like Whole Foods, Metropolitan Market, PCC.
QFC, yeah.
Yeah, well, they actually have a mid-range one, and that's where QFC is gonna fall. And here we're gonna have Safeway, Albertsons, and outlet groceries, right? Cash and carries, yeah, those kinds of things. So,
QFC is high cost.
it's medium cost.
I have another cool example.
Yeah.
I have a friend
Well,
who
Safeway's probably in the middle too.
I have a friend who lives here on Capitol Hill, and he did, so it's one person, one month, or,
Mhm.
so for each month he shopped at a different place. He shopped at the Whole Foods on South Lake Union, he shopped at the QFC that's on Broadway, 3 blocks that way, and then he shopped at,
Safeway?
no, Metropolitan, or no, Madison Market.
Okay, yeah,
Right, which is a
Co-op.
cooperative
yeah,
natural grocery store.
yeah.
And he bought 20 things at each place, like milk, bread,
Same time,
cheese,
yeah.
right? Same brand, if at all possible, and shopped at each place for 1 month, and then compared them,
Uh-huh.
and found that actually he spent the least money at Whole Foods and the most at QFC.
Interesting.
In part because he thinks that the QFC that's on Broadway actually
Is
raises
more
his
expensive.
prices because
Catering
it's,
towards the neighborhood.
well, see, there's another one down here, but that one is
That
really,
one's more hipster.
it's
it
right
is.
there, it's conveniently located for everyone who lives in
You
that
can't take the
area.
cart outside. Like, you
Yeah.
gotta walk with your
Yeah, I
groceries.
tried doing that.
Yeah.
And it broke.
Yeah, I tried that once too, and I was like, damn it. Yeah.
I was gonna say, also, because I shop at Safeway.
Yeah.
But I shop at many Safeways, depends on the area you're in, like
Yes.
the Safeway. The one right here on 15th and John, the prices are lower than the one right here on 22nd and Madison. And then the one in the south in the Seattle, in the Rainier Beach area is cheaper than both.
Sure, yeah. And again, that's business acumen, right? They know that the neighborhoods have different levels of
Oh.
income.
I mean, I think it
So they can make
goes all the way
choices.
to certain products that they're selling at these
Sure,
stores too,
yeah.
and the quality of the
Yeah,
food.
yeah. Well, like go ahead.
How about Trader Joe's?
Trader Joe's.
Yeah.
Trader Joe's is gonna be a mid to high level grocery store. So anyhow, so they take into account the cost of the grocery store, and they did it very much the same way as I'm sorry, what's your name?
Kate.
Kate, as Kate was describing with her friend. There's something called a market basket measure, and I, for the life of me, could not find what goes into that market basket. I looked and looked and looked last night. But anyway, there's secret shoppers that go around and do market basket measures of how much the same products cost in every grocery store. And so they use that data to determine which were falling into high, medium, and low cost categories. But what is interesting is if we combine this data about the cost of the grocery store with the ability to access based on different transportation, the black areas are food deserts. So this top column is 10 minutes walking. So sort of regardless of the cost of the grocery store, if you need to walk to your grocery store, you are not looking good if you live in the Puget Sound area, right? It is not that easy. Again, if you're willing to walk up to a mile, you're in a little bit better shape.
So that's what those little white chunks are,
Yeah,
like
then-
a mile radius.
Yeah, then you're able to get to them. You're in better shape if you don't want to shop at a high cost grocery supermarket. But if you live in here, which is what? South King County. And you need to walk up to a mile to an affordable grocery store, you are not in good shape. There is not much there, right? And transit, same thing. Look at this. Boom, nothing. And then 10-minute driving, still not good if you're in the expensive grocery store. If you're willing to, if you shop at a low-cost supermarket, you're in better shape, right? But then these high-cost supermarkets, like Whole Foods and whatnot, they're not down there, right? Because they don't think they're gonna make their money there.
Why do they open in Detroit?
This is an interesting question. Yeah,
There's a PCC that's going to open in Columbia City
yeah.
in like 6 months.
Just
Interesting.
Park Avenue.
There's one over there
That one is
too.
closing
It's
and
closing.
it's moving to the corner of South Edmonds and Rainier.
So,
Where is Detroit?
Detroit is in Michigan, so it's in the middle of the country. But it's very economically depressed at the moment, and has been over many years. So in terms of Detroit, why they opened in Detroit is they are being subsidized to open in Detroit. So their prices are subsidized, they don't plan to make any money on the store for a very long time. Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, I'm wondering where the whole idea of nutritional knowledge would fit into this. I mean, that would be a desert of demand rather than access.
Exactly, yeah. Well, there's actually an interesting study, let me see if I have my citation here. Yeah.
Where do small grocery stores fit in? Like, I know that in South King County, South Seattle, you have tons of little Ethiopian or Asian.
It has to do with how they're licensed. So if they're not licensed as a supermarket, they're not showing up in this data.
Even though the variety of foods they're carrying is
Yes.
mapping closer to supermarket than.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of times they're licensed as like ethnic shops rather than grocery stores. So to address your question, there was a study that was done by Walker in 2012 in the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition that looked at if you live in a food oasis and you're low income, food oasis is like lots of access, and you live in a food desert with low income, and you make choices about your food, the choices are essentially the same.
Oh.
Yeah, so
But
even if
still
you have
have-
access, you're making the same choices. And that ties to time, knowledge, and cultural values, right? Cultural values. So, okay, so we can see that there's probably more going on in terms of food deserts than what the USDA is saying. And part of that, as you all have pointed out, is profitability and capitalism. This is Michelle Obama being awesome with Walmart. So Michelle Obama has been using Walmart, subsidizing Walmart to, I shouldn't say Michelle Obama, the government is subsidizing Walmart, to build stores in food deserts, because people aren't building stores in food deserts because they can't make any money there, right? We are a capitalist nation. If you are going to a low income area, you're not gonna make that much money, right? So there's a couple concerns here. I'm sure many of them you can come up with on your own. But the Walmart is supposed to be providing then more fresh foods and vegetables, but they don't have the manpower to do it because they're not willing to hire more people, right? Remember, fresh foods and vegetables are perishable. So they build these stores and then they're empty. There's like no, like things are not there. People go in for their vegetables, they're not there. And this is according to an article in Business Weeks by Julie Chapman in 2012. And in addition, they've made this promise to build 300 new fresh foods Walmarts. They're being subsidized by 2016, okay? In May of 2012, and I couldn't find updated data, in May of 2012 they had built 23. That was a year after the announcement. So maybe they're on track. Maybe they'll get another 25 every year. But at that time, building was stalled because they could not solve this produce issue, because they couldn't keep the produce stocked, or the produce was bad, because they were not willing to hire more people. Conversely, I think it is hypocritical that Walmart, who is a known entity in terms of underpaying staff, right, and keeping people in low-income brackets, is then being subsidized to help solve a problem that affects that group. So yeah, I take issue with that, I guess. Not I guess, I know I do. So the last thing to consider is privilege, and this is where culture comes into play. A lot of our alternative food movements are motivated by the good intentions of white people who have white culture behind them, right? So a couple things to keep in mind here is that a lot of these movements say, oh, go out to your garden, get your hands in the dirt, grow your own vegetables, blah, blah, blah. That assumes a privilege of time, it assumes a privilege of knowledge, and it assumes a privilege that your people never had to do that before. And this is something that folks forget. There's a real irony in taking inner city kids to a garden and saying, hey, I'm a white person, I'm running this educational garden, now go out there and volunteer for a couple hours. Right? That's problematic. And we rarely point to it and say that it's a problem, because it's not something that's easy for us to articulate, but it is a problem, and it's been documented by Julie Guthman in 2006. And so the three messages that our alternative food movements give in terms of solving these food deserts is, people just don't know any better, right? They don't know any better, but that comes from a very white perspective, right? Culturally, privileged white culture says, yes, vegetables are great, no problem, but that comes from a background where you always had access to those things, right? So people know better, it's a matter of access. The other one is that it feels good to put your hands in the dirt, and that's where this becomes a problem, right? It's like, it didn't always feel good to put your hands in the dirt, and it wasn't always a choice. And the last one is this vision of seizing land and being this sort of agrarian dream, like, grow your backyard, it's this beautiful thing. And that becomes problematic because of migrant mother, right? That Native American woman didn't have land because we had taken it away from her. So when we continue to disseminate that message that you need to seize land and grow something, it comes from a white perspective and a colonial perspective as well. So my hope is that your takeaway here is that a lot of our food injustice and our food deserts are complicated with social inequity and greater social inequities than just the low income, low access. There's a lot more going on there. And that first we eat and then we do everything else. So being able to continue to work on this problem is important, but keeping those larger structural inequities in mind is equally important. So with that, in case it wasn't clear that I did research, it was there. I went through it really fast.
What format did you use?
I used APA.
Okay.
I'm happy to pass them along. So let's discuss. I'm glad that you discussed as we went, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or feelings or perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, well, a lot of the poor areas that have the smaller stores, actually the items in those stores are more expensive than your big
Yeah.
box stores.
Yeah.
Number one, so I think a lot of it is just like education, and going into those communities and letting them know that they're actually spending more for their money when they take that bus and go back around.
Yeah.
So we plan.
And actually, one of the articles I looked at, the one from King County actually said that that maybe some of the advocacy needs to be not about dropping a grocery store or a Walmart in that neighborhood, but getting a bus route to a grocery store that is more affordable, right, and making that available. Yep.
What about the food farm that's going in Beacon Hill? I just like wondering what you think about that. It's supposed to be like the biggest one in the nation.
Yeah, the food forest.
Yeah, forest.
Yeah. So I don't
It's the
know.
only one in the nation, actually.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's not very big. I went by it on the bus recently, and it's
7 acres is what I heard.
it's small. What's there right now is much smaller.
So I don't know anything about it directly. Anecdotally, I would say that it is probably a pretty privileged space, right, at the moment. Maybe that will change over time. But I think probably the people it wants to serve, it's not serving yet, I guess is the way to put it. There's
It's
this,
also out in the middle of nowhere.
yeah, so it's maybe not that
Right by the
accessible.
freeway.
Yeah, I don't know where it was, but that's crazy.
Yeah.
I didn't know like
What's
where it
that
was.
about? Food?
So it's basically a I think it's an available space where food is grown and you can go pick it and have it for yourself, basically, right? There's an example related to this in California where these sort of open food spaces are created, whether they're community gardens or markets that are subsidized. And the people that shop there tend to be more privileged people who like supporting the idea or use those spaces are the ones that like supporting the idea rather than the groups that they're meant to serve, right? So, but again, I don't know much about the Beacon Hill project in particular.
It's really in its infancy. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of it's fruit trees, and those take
Forever.
5 to 10 years to mature.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm wondering about is the difference between people, especially people who are recent immigrants who are coming from cultures where people cook a lot,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And the difference, I would love to see difference on data between,
Mhm.
groups of people in poverty who have those skills and traditions, and
Yeah.
then people who are in a position where that's not as much of a tradition
Yeah.
in their community, and
Yeah.
what difference that does and doesn't make.
I think that's a really fascinating cultural study. There's been a lot of interesting writing about Vietnamese immigrants, and is it Vietnamese? Is Vietnamese kimchi or is that Korean? Korean. White lady. Okay. So Korean. So there's a lot of interesting articles about kimchi because kimchi is something that immigrants have made when they arrive. They send it to school with their kids. The kids say, "Mom, I don't want this at school anymore because it makes me stink." Right? The other kids say, "I stink because I smell like kimchi." This is very vinegary, right? It's like a pickle. So then those kids stop cooking, right? They don't make kimchi. And then because they don't make kimchi, they don't cook, they aren't cooking with their parents, they aren't eating their parents' food. What the parents do to appease the kids is go to the convenience foods, right? So in terms of our immigrant populations, they can't afford then to like buy the prepared foods that are American foods. So they go to the convenience foods that are more affordable. So I think there's some cycles there in terms of food consumption and production. And then at some point that kid might turn around and decide, you know what, I love kimchi. All of you be damned, and change. But yeah.
Do you see any correlation with health?
Yes. There's
That's been documented?
There's a lot of research and documentation about how in these food deserts we see increased obesity and heart problems. It's just so damn depressing. I mean, it really is. Yeah.
I would be really careful in linking obesity to to health as a measure of health, because there's actually quite a bit of contention around the science of that. So I do not think automatic that A, food deserts lead to obesity, or B, that obesity leads to more health.
Oh no,
I mean, I know it's something
I
we all
don't
do
use that
use,
correlation. My correlation, and I don't have the research on this because I didn't print it or use it in my presentation. My correlation is there have been proven relationships between low income and obesity, and separately low income and poor health, or not poor health, poor heart condition, right? So, and heart disease, I should say. So those are definitely separate correlations related to low income that are then applied to the food desert situation. There isn't a direct relationship, but the low income link is what puts them together typically.
There's no link between obesity and health?
There are no studies that actually prove any causative links between purely the condition of being, I prefer to use fat myself, and say diabetes or
Sure.
heart disease or other cardiovascular.
Right. And in terms of obesity or being fat, again, those are labels that are defined somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? And so, in the same way that we can say, food insecurity is a perspective, obesity or weight is another one, because that's a clinical definition rather than a living one. Yeah.
So the government focus, was it just on getting businesses to open up, or was there any education that was going to be poured into the lower income?
There are certainly education efforts.
Nutritional
Yeah,
education
nutritional
with
efforts.
the kids.
For example,
Change generations as they
yes. For example, in South King County, there's a program called Food Sense. Did any of you go to school in South King County? Have this? They don't have this program in North King County, just South King County. It's called Food Sense, and it's a nutritional program that goes in, it hires educators to go in and do nutrition education with all ages of kids. So, it's like when Junior Achievement or somebody would come to your class. It's the same thing, but for nutrition. And then the goal is to send that information home with the child so it goes to their parent. However, the funding has been cut for that program, and so now they're trying to do nutrition and literacy because they can get funded for literacy but not nutrition. And partly because some of those monies are going more now towards corporate efforts or subsidizing costs. Sorry. I feel so depressed when I'm talking about these topics. Yeah.
So, in terms of the messaging around food deserts, is that sort of what you study? What types of
Yeah.
problems?
So, the things that I study are related to sort of the Oreo example, right? So, when I show you that package of Sam's Club Oreos, what is your reaction? Do you say, "Oh, great, I love Oreos," and eat one, or do you go, "I don't eat Oreos," right? Or do you say, "Oh, that's not organic"? Conversely, when I show you the Numinos, which are organic, right, but they're still in Oreo, right? How do you respond to that? And what are the cultural and identity-based elements that cause that reaction? Right?
The pricing of these different products, is it related to, say, overstock of it? Say they have way too much tomatoes at one QFC, so they figured we'll have a sell on tomatoes, versus the QFC down the street has been selling it normally, so they don't have to price them at a higher price.
Yeah, I don't know
lower
much
price.
about that formally, but my gut would say yes, right? I worked at a farmer's market for